Alrighty, hello every folks, and good morning. Welcome to a little bit of a discussion here on FF Tic Tacs. Specifically, what I wanted to talk about here is a couple things. For one thing, as far as the comment that has regularly come up from the last few videos here, essentially stating that any definitive version of any product whatsoever needs to always have just basically all content whatsoever from all versions in order to truly be definitive. And I wanted to throw out a little bit of an argument there, just at the very least for your consideration. And additionally, as far as the kinds of changes that we might potentially see in the future, as far as just kind of the rebalances that may potentially be expected, because they've obviously been talking about different rebalances and such. There's been a few different ideas floated out there, but as always, they've been fairly vague about this stuff. And the reason that I find it interesting is because that kind of vagary oftentimes carries a bit more meaning behind it than it initially seems. Because oftentimes what they're actually trying to say is that there's just a bunch of little bits and pieces that they just absolutely won't tell you until release and whatnot. And again, Tor is probably the perfect example of this, where, for example, there were a lot of things that nobody really expected to see, like just all of a sudden mini-bosses, all of a sudden total reworks of a lot of the sort of like post-game fights and stuff like that. The fact that nobody mentioned a dang thing about any of the items being relocated, only to then realize after it released that we're sitting there trying to grind for like axe, spear, and hammer in the Frompa Wildwood, wondering if it just got removed from the game. A lot of people were insisting that it got removed from the game, only to then realize like, oh shoot, it actually got relocated to a way more convenient place and whatnot. So to that end, what I wanted to do was just kind of throw out a little bit of a thought experiment for you, hopefully to be taken in good faith here. Again, like, I get it. Some folks are upset as far as the Ward line stuff not directly coming over, but I want to point out that we have a lot of stuff that has been hinted at so far, essentially stating something to the tune of we're basically getting a lot of that stuff in a different form, give or take. Like, that's kind of the rough translation of a lot of what we're seeing there. So first and foremost, let's talk about that whole remake being definitive thing. Let's go ahead and discuss arguably the most definitive remake to ever definitive remake. So this is going to be RE1 Remake, technically originally from the GameCube and stuff like that, but it's seen so many ports and re-releases that it's not even funny. But the thing is, it actually is a surprisingly similar situation. And you might be saying, wait a minute, but hold on, FF Tic Tacs took out the Ward Alliance stuff. They didn't add anything, and it's just straight downhill from there. And the thing was, this is actually a surprisingly similar comparison. Namely, it's a case where they, at the time, were praised as basically including most of the original game, and essentially going and retooling a bunch of things to make the balance better, to make things just kind of function better in general. Things like being able to actually use your knife to some degree of success without needing to use a menu screen glitch, being able to let's say to go and burn zombies and stuff, giving you a few more tools. But many forget just how many things were actually taken out of this one too, including things like most of the cutscenes to deal with Barry and whatnot, including things like if we want to argue about we need to always have the definitive versions of stuff. To me personally, the most definitive version of this game was always going to be the DS version, essentially being the one where you had knife fight minigames. You had essentially the pocket knife and stuff like that, where essentially you were able to fight with your knife at all times, which I personally found really enjoyable. You had a lot of new rooms and new puzzles and new content and redone voice work that was basically the original janky voice things, but essentially redone in better quality because they wanted to keep the original weird suckage and whatnot. But the point is, this one did, for all of its incredible quality, actually remove a decent chunk of stuff from the original one, including, like, early on in the original, you could have a lot more freedom when exploring the mansion, whereas in the remake, everyone's locked in to essentially exploring the kind of starting arrowhead rooms and stuff like that. So if you're somebody that loves going through it over and over, you might not necessarily see, as much freedom or as much openness in the early parts there. It gives you a little bit less freedom as far as routing is concerned, and it's a bit more linear. And that's the thing, though. As far as these different options go, people still preferred this one in general because, well, the better presentation, you had the better well, the better voice work in general. The extra difficulty modes added interesting new ideas. Like instead of let's say just having slightly harder difficulties or slightly reworked items, you had stuff like I think it was like one difficult zombie mode or something like that, where effectively you couldn't even dodge everything because there was just one zombie covered in grenades that was following you around at all times. Essentially adding like a pursuer type thing to this thing. Or you had cases where where the new visuals just lead to a lot more immersion and stuff like that. And I mean, obviously, when it comes to these two games, they're going to be fairly different. But the idea is that technically speaking, this one, for all of its definitiveness and what have you, didn't actually have a lot of the sort of stuff that was there in other versions. You didn't have some of the director's cut stuff. You didn't have some of the extra item reworks. There were areas that were removed. And this actually continued on with, for example, everyone still loved the RE2 remake, but still there was going to be a case to be made there where you could definitely make the argument that the RE2 remake did remove more than needed to be removed, and this actually continued carrying on until eventually the RE3 remake, wherein people finally kind of were just a little bit over stuff actually getting removed, where they took like 80% of the game out for RE3. But the point is that losing a little bit is not that big of a deal. Losing a little bit is oftentimes going to be necessary to give you that sort of idealized experience, as it were. Like for me personally, one of those things that I always appreciated about this one, and this is actually something that was from that DS version, we didn't get the pocket knife because the pocket knife essentially got rid of having to worry about inventory space for your knife, which I personally enjoyed. I really don't know why they didn't keep that for later versions. But for example, the manual reload that I just did there, it's a small detail. It's a small detail. Nobody ever practically needs to use it because you just go into the menu and instantly reload your gun. But personally, I found it to be a really good feature. Whoops, hit some stuff on the dock there, accidentally disconnected everything. Anyway, though, so yeah, like as far as even the RE1 remake, again, like the most definitive remake to ever remake, we still have a case where like rooms are cut, a lot of the dialogue and extra scenes when it comes to a lot of people's favorite character in the form of Barry is just missing. A lot of the story events are a lot more linear. A lot of the progression through the mansion is a lot more linear. A lot of the puzzles are a lot more just again directly linear. Like you're not necessarily doing as many puzzle or as many different reroutes to try to get different crests or what have you. So in general, again, technically speaking, obviously there's been a lot of visual upgrades. There's been a lot of little tweaks and cool changes and whatever else. But the point I'm trying to get at is, in a lot of ways, it has essentially changed to the point where technically it was removing stuff from the original. You didn't have extra content from like the DS version, the Saturn version. Like the Saturn version had an extra boss. You had a different extra boss in the DS version. Again, like the extra mini games, extra multiplayer modes in that one. But again, nobody was crying about it because the definitive version was essentially a rework of the original version that kept the vibes of that original. So let's go back to FFT to discuss that same idea. Okay, seems my time today is going to be a bit more limited than I expected, so let's go ahead and just do the brief version here. So basically, when it comes to what we might potentially expect to see as far as reworks, one sign that we already have is the fact that they are producing two different versions of the thing. If it was simply UI updates and a few extra text lines, there is no way in hell that they would have said, here's the original version, here's the non-original version. It just would be redundant at that point, right? And if it was that way, if it wasn't meant to be a situation where you have two different flavors of a similar idea available, then we wouldn't have had, let's say, again, a situation like Tor, where, again, they were going and rebuilding from an earlier version, but in that particular case, they basically had just the reborn version, because there was so much stuff wrong with the original version in that case that it almost was... honestly, if somebody saw it as an embarrassment over how many weird things the PSP release of Tactics Ogre had, I wouldn't be shocked. Again, loved the game to bits, but like its design was strange to say the least. But I would expect to see that since they are making so many changes, that they probably. Again, that's probably the reason that we see two different releases on here. But as far as the types of releases, typically what I've seen in the comments is something along the lines of like, well, why didn't they just like rebalance the War of the Lions classes or something like that? And given that we see that the classes were mentioned as like we considered it and decided not to, the way that I see it is that they saw the original ones as a kind of complete circle of available things, right? Just a complete progression of the kinds of stuff that you'd want to see there. So like if you had characters that were expected to be like just walking juggernauts and whatever else, and they ended up becoming lancers, or you wanted characters to be a bit more of the sort of like original Dark Knight archetype there, you had stuff like the samurai, because basically, the samurai does a lot of similar things. It has a more expansive toolbox than whatever else, just with more drawbacks, ironically, because of a draw out command there. But they're, limited to kind of two-handed weapons there. I don't believe they're draw. Yeah, I think they're draw outs. No, I think you can actually use them with other weapons. You just have to keep that stock of swords with them. So either way, you've got a sort of a very expensive resource that can potentially break from using the class's skills. They are able to do a lot of similar things in terms of healing, removing MP, just kind of attacking in an area and what have you. But essentially, again, they are more limited in what they do, and they're at the very tail end of all of that progression. So effectively, the way that I see it, it's a little bit of a case where it's kind of almost redundant in a way. So like the actual role of the thing is, functionally speaking, kind of stuff that was originally there just for special characters, if we're talking about the Dark Knight. And again, for the Onion Knight, it's just like, why is this even here at all? As far as the unique characters, like we already talked about balance-wise, it just seems weird to have replacements of existing classes, but again, if we're talking about character building, world building wise, whatever else, like even in a normal playthrough, I already rarely find myself using Mustadio these days. Last few times I've played through this thing, he's just been sitting here being a permanent bench warmer. So if, for example, they wanted to boost somebody like Mustadio, their answer wouldn't be to bring in, to go and bring in Balthier, because it's like, he's already warming the bench. Now he's just warming it even harder. It's like, here's just cooler Mustadio. But no, in this particular case, if he's got additional lines, if his skills do more stuff, then then we might see a bit more coming out of him. Because we have seen notes that they were planning on redoing some specific skills. They didn't really want to get into the exact specifics of it, but like getting into the fact that they wanted to rework certain skills in order to try and give them more value. And they did mention, again, things like charge. And the thing is, when we saw those kinds of things being redone for Tor, they were oftentimes done in ways they wouldn't initially think of. Again, combining things like Eagle Eye, which previously never got used, with, again, Overpower, which is in and of itself like a weird niche that was there, in which you had a skill that either was way too good or completely useless depending on the context. But in that particular case, by finding a middle ground between both, where effectively it didn't have a cost but also wasn't always readily available, where it allowed you to bypass one of the main defenses of that, like one of the main things that some attack like that would potentially be defended from. Weird way to phrase it, but screw it, I'm tired. It essentially was a mix of multiple different things. So, like, if they were redoing charge or something like that, maybe they would have a case where it instead of just simply saying, hey, we reduce the amount of time, we increase the power, something like that, it might be something along the lines of being able to track the target a bit better, because right now it works with ranged attacks, but if, let's say, melee attacks were like, you follow the character around or something, I doubt it would be something that extreme, but maybe it causes different debuffs at different levels. Like, that would be something definitely worth doing. Like, if you manage to pull off a charge +8 and it drops a doom along with it, like, that'd be pretty freaking sweet. Not to mention having a guaranteed debuff would be a very, like, Tactics Ogre style thing to add, which would be pretty darn cool. Let's see, what else did they end up adding? I forget if they mentioned anything besides charge, but like, either way, it feels like if I were to throw out one prediction on there, it probably would be like charge is getting debuffs or something. But I would expect it to be something completely out of the blue, Okay, so let's take another quick peek at Tor here, just to, again, get you into the mindset here. Because, again, it's never direct with these people. It's like, it's never a direct one-to-one, like, oh, they just needed to tweak some numbers over here thing. There's always something else, and you can usually read between the lines, which is why I've been so confident this whole time of, like, whenever they're talking about, like, oh, no, they're gonna not include this, that, or the other, like, but, we saw no reason to include this, that, or the other, and you see those immediate comments like, oh my god, they're just lazy sitting there on their gilded throne and just, like, picking their boogers all day. And it's like, dude, please, read between the lines. Okay, for example, with the Lord, right? The Lord in Tor, original PlayStation version, basically it could use. I mean, everyone could already use pretty much all equipment, with the exception of guns. And it's like if you knew how to use guns, you could shoot them, and if you didn't, you could club somebody with them. But if you're using guns, that was like the only weapon that you could use. Basically, it's a whole thing. That was a weird system. In the PSP version, they added restrictions for a lot of weapons, and so the Lord's whole thing was that he could use all weapons, once again, except for guns for some reason. But he was very weirdly restricted in terms of his skills, and this was actually a function, presumably, of the augment system in that one, in that he couldn't equip any equipment that would cause his augment of any element to go above, I think it was like 14 or something. So this basically meant that he was just very pick and choosy about what kinds of stuff he could equip, right? And so essentially what we saw this time around is that he basically gets almost everything as far as equipment goes. Please bear in mind some stuff will be, like, obviously empty in the inventory in this particular case. But for example, like he wasn't able to equip vests before. Now he can at the very least equip the Jiggy. He was a bit more limited in terms of his gauntlet choices. Was a bit more limited in terms of, well, a lot of random bits and pieces here and there. But as far as his skills went, all of a sudden this time around he had access to every skill. It wasn't pick and choosy. It was literally just any class he came across, he just absorbed now. And I would not be shocked. Since this is a mechanic that they love to do for their main character, I wouldn't be shocked if, for example, with Ramza, the reason that they decided Dark Knight is unnecessary is, like, sure, roles-wise, it does have other roles, other classes that fit that role, but I've been saying for a while it's been weird how Gaff ends up going into immediately crystallizing, and in his particular case, like, if he were to, let's say, absorb those skills using his already inbuilt, like, blue mage kind of stuff, I don't see why that wouldn't fit. There's only one fight that you, well, actually, I guess technically there's a few fights that you fight Gaff in, and if he were to just absorb those skills, that makes sense. It would essentially be him learning those things at the same time that Delita does, more or less. If he were to absorb just eat the dude's crystal or whatever else, absorbing the skills there, it makes sense. It fits. So personal prediction is that we'll probably end up seeing that as just part of Rams at some point, just kind of throwing that out there. But additionally, they love recontextualization, okay? So, like, back, to give you an idea here, back in, again, like the PSP version of this thing, something like Conserve MP, was a case where it was oftentimes kind of expensive, and so usually people would just use items. And so one of the first backlashes that came out when this game came out was like, oh no, you can't buy MP items at the store anymore. But now that also incentivizes somebody to go and, let's say, learn the locations of pickup items for MP items, because those are still there. Or things like Conserve MP, which allow you to cast for free and stuff like that. So they love to oftentimes remove things, like just kind of pruning, I guess would be the better way to put it, where they'll essentially take away one thing in order to emphasize another. Going back to the TK here, there was no like TK in the PSP version that probably wasn't running, like, let's say the Headsman or something. So like Headsman back in PSP was more or less mandatory for the class, because it essentially went and improved their main kind of skill that they were known for using, which was Lament of the Dead. Like, they had two skills. They had Terrifying Impact, which terrifies the target once they hit them, and then also guaranteed a debuff on the weapon. And then they had a secondary, which was Lament of the Dead, which essentially caused fear in an area around them, but by nature of the way that ranked skills worked in that one, it was basically just, like, never gonna hit. Like, it's weird because 30% is really valuable in this version, but 30% was really not valuable in that version. So like in this one, there's, like, everything was retweaked in a lot of different ways so that you're free to take risks more often. Back in the PSP version, like, if you spent all of your points on using Lament of the Dead or something, you were stuck there for a while. You were committing real hard to that action. And so you're basically stuck there, and then if all those 30%'s missed, like, you're fucked, basically. And so then, again, they recontextualized a lot of things, let's say, about this unit. So now this Lament just happens on its own. Its odds to hit are higher, it's free to use, it doesn't take you any time to use, it just does itself. It's just, like, constantly pulsing out of the character, give or take. And, we have stuff like them using cudgels, which they could always use before, but now there's a reason because it extends the range on their abilities, which means if you're combining this with them holding a staircase or something, them just spamming something cheap like sleep now matters quite a decent bit. You have like, let's say, stuff like what was previously Spell Strike, which could get overwritten by a character's natural evasion. Now this is always going to be at least a guaranteed minimum percent chance to hit, which was a new mechanic in this one. That again was just one of those many things that they just never mentioned. And so something like that meant that a sleep spamming heavy Terranite here was genuinely a pretty big threat. It was like one of those big attrition threats or what have you. Reworking the abilities on certain weapons, like use effects on most weapons back in that original did not really have much of a reason to be used, because they were just way too oddly specific and oftentimes would require you to rank up completely different skills than you had available. And so, for example, taking this thing, which is like a sword that's supposed to open up like portals to hell and whatnot, and giving it the ability to resurrect people, that's pretty cool. That's pretty darn nifty. But again, a lot of this stuff is stuff that they never mentioned. They never really brought it up. They're like, oh, we're just doing a humble little remake of the original version. No biggie, nothing to worry about. And then it's just like it comes out and and it's just like all these things are technically the same in a lot of cases, or technically look like they have less stuff there, but they have a lot more interesting context. So either way, that kind of interesting recontextualization, like let's say this was going back to what I was talking about earlier, where in the case of the Fruit of the Adept, where it was a thoroughly useless item in previous versions, and now since MP items were something that you couldn't buy at the store, now suddenly there previously was little reason to use anything that improved your health bar, or your MP bar rather. Now you have an item that basically will scale how much it's restoring MP wise based off of your bar, and so this means that early on it could be the equivalent of one of those cheap items, but if you go and work it around a little bit, maybe it might end up being something a decent bit more useful. It's either like a very cheap little booster item, or potentially could be something more valuable depending on how you want to play it, and that's fun. Like again, that's just a fun little contextual difference thing. I mean, there's even some weird mechanics that you just never really would have expected to come about. Like, let me see if I can find it here. Yeah, like this guy. Like, they even went and did a bunch of little fun thingies here, there, wherever, where they basically just had like a bunch of inbuilt, in-jokes or what have you. Like, a lot of people were scared of the SNES version of two particular characters who showed up as just random boss fights that only show up once if you do a perfect clear of like half of one of the longest dungeons in the game. And they just sort of show up and thoroughly whoop your ass. And then you try to reset the fight and they're like, what? That didn't happen. It's just a normal fight. You're just crazy. So again, just expect a little surprise like that. But like, the reason that I bring up this guy is like, there's randomly just units that specifically do not match their normal elements, and it's just like, just cool, whatever, just whatever you feel like doing about that. Like a griffin that is a dark element, kind of oddly specific. What's its purpose? Well, I mean, maybe it might be slightly better with a couple of its abilities, I guess. Not its main ability, but I mean, maybe that's just what you're looking for. And it's just these weird little niche things that just sort of pop up wherever that gives you interesting ideas to potentially play around with. Like revisiting one of the end game areas to go see what happened with one of the random liches that can spawn there. He spawns in with an impossible element that makes him like paradoxically way better because he froze to death. Like, it's just, again, there's all these little things that they never mentioned, and I would expect a lot of surprises to come out of this remake, okay? So, again, before crying over, oh, we didn't get directly the same exact port that we've gotten 10 billion times already, think about the potential for surprises and neat little updates, because there's a lot out there. So, anyway, that'll be about that. Y'all have yourselves a good one, take care, and I'll see you later.